Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the East Podcast. My name is Partha Srinivasan and I am the guy who's hungry for technology and everything around technology. Well, not hungry for technology, hungry for information about how technology works. So, if you've known me from before, you've known that I've been a part of a podcast called Tech Tree, which I used to do quite regularly. Well, we did 10 episodes in Dubai with a couple of my friends, Chirag and Shaban. Chirag is also our guest for today. But before we jump into what Chirag is doing on this show, in case you're joining us for the first time, the East Podcast is basically a podcast that aims to bring technology closer to your senses. We talk about everything from enterprise technology to consumer technology and everything in between. And what I try to do is I bring guests on every 2 weeks and we try and address what the technologies are, where they come from, what they mean for you. And hopefully at the end of the episode, you'll have learned something. And we try to simplify as many concepts as we can. And if you can't do it in one episode, we go ahead and break it down into multiples. So you will find a lot of our guests coming back for more because, we're just that amazing. And I hope you find that content amazing as well. So please do subscribe to this podcast and we look forward to hearing your opinions and views as well. But coming back to our show today, we're talking about podcasts, and my longest stint with the podcast has been with Tech Tree, and Tech Tree has been a technology podcast that I've been a part of for quite a while now. I still hold it very dear to my heart. And Chirag, my co-host of that, is now a guest on this show. So Chirag, welcome to the East Podcast.
Thanks, Partha. Thanks for having me.
How's it feel to be on the other side of the table?
Yeah, it's always nice, actually. It's nice when someone's talking to you about what you care about and what you're doing all day, because that's what I'll end up doing most of the time. And it's also nice to not have to, you can almost take a step back from the amount of switched onness, if that's the word, that I generally have to maintain when we're doing interviews. So, keeping people on track and stuff. Today, that's your job and not mine. So that's nice.
Hey, that's good. Chirag, tell our audience a little bit about...
Sure. So my name is Chirag, of course, and so I run AMAEYA Media, which is a podcast network based out of Dubai, UAE. We currently have 14 shows, which is a combination of what we call original programming, shows that we create on topics that we want to do shows about, and then we also have what we call branded programming, which is shows that are owned and by companies. Who are trying to add podcasts either as part of a communication strategy or just brand awareness and so on. So that's what we've been doing over the last couple of years. And that's what we're also going to talk about a little bit today.
So Chirag, actually, you take podcasting, the business of podcasting, really very seriously. I mean, you literally did a state of the industry report, and it's actually very interesting to read. I'm going to link that in the show notes. But walk us through what it is just so far, and then we'll go ahead and dive a little bit into that as well.
Yes, I mean, look, we one of the things that we find, and I think this is true for a lot of things in our part of the world, is that, podcasting is really very prevalent and rather mature in particularly the US, but even in some parts of Europe. But when you look at our region, we look at Middle East, we look at India, and even to some extent Asia Pacific, we're seeing a lot of growth in the industry, right? So a lot of people that are jumping on or trying to do podcasts that are catering to the region, but we just don't have enough in terms of data. So a lot of the data points that we use even today are American reports or American-driven reports. And I think so that was one of the things that us here as an industry we've been talking about for quite some time now. It has come up in a couple of sort of our annual conferences and those kind of things. And so our goal there was to try and start this this report from a point of view to say, what can we look at locally and what can we look at in terms of regional trends that may mirror what's happening elsewhere, but there may be some deviations, and we kind of need to start to understand that if we are to build the industry forward, because as anybody will tell you, content is, at the end of the day, is for the consumer. And so if we don't know what the consumers really want, we're not going to be making the right kind of decisions. Especially for us when we look at it from the business of podcasting, but I think it's true for any independent creator as well, right? You can be very passionate about a certain topic, but at the end of the day, you're building contents for people to listen to, and so we kind of need to know what they want. Podcasting as an industry, and this is something we address in the report as well, is extremely decentralized. So we do not have a single company or single platform that owns all aspects of the podcasting chain. So, I mean, a simple example is something like YouTube, right? So when you look for video, YouTube pretty much owns everything, right? So the creators are there, the consumers are there, all the hosting and all the data on the content is also there. Something like that doesn't exist for podcasts, which means that, which is a good thing in my opinion from a creator point of view and from an almost sort of an independence of the medium point of view.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes with challenges, right? Because it also means that now data isn't centralized, so data is pretty fragmented everywhere. Not everybody reports the data in the same way because different companies and different people are doing different things in different parts of the chain. And so this kind of report was, for me, it's like the starting point to say, let's look at where the industry is today. Let's look specifically also at some things that we've seen in the region because we've been in the region operating a number of podcasts and interacting with companies, with brands, with people, and with listeners. And what are some of the overarching themes we're seeing and some of the trends we're seeing to provide kind of a baseline from where we can begin.
So how long did it actually take you to put this report together? You've reached out to about 500 plus people. Actually, you reached out to a whole lot of people, but 500 plus responses, and you've got some pretty solid data. So how long did it take for you to put this together?
This edition of the report took us about 3 months to put together. Although we'd been working on it as an idea for a couple months prior to that. But those months were more logistical kind of things to try and figure out how we would run it and stuff as well. We also initially the idea was to look at an independent survey, but we found that to be an extremely ineffective option as of today because in addition to costs being fairly insane, at least from our perspective, the real problem was also the fact that they could not guarantee us responses. And I think one of the big things with data is that, obviously I'd argue the more responses, the better.
Obviously.
But when you can't even, it's very difficult to talk about trends and results on 100 people. So
actually, one of the things that I want to ask you is that it says 500 responses. How many invalid responses did you get? Because I'm assuming that's also going to be
a few more. No, a few more, but that it wasn't that large. It was just what we termed as valid responses. They involved a lot of duplicates. So we had an incentive for the survey, of course. We were gifting away the Apple AirPods Pro.
Right.
And I think that was one of the reasons why people took the survey multiple times. And so, which I understand, of course, but that also means that, that skews our data, which was not something we wanted. So we tried to administer and figure out, where that had happened and removed some of those. There were others where there were some issues with the data that had been submitted as well. So those were the kind of things. And then we did a lot of cleanup also because when we say, when you provide something, it's quite funny, but when you provide a question such as, where do you listen to podcasts? And option 1 is commuting. And then there's 3 other options. And then there's an other slot because we felt like maybe there's something we haven't caught. There's a trend we aren't seeing yet. And then it would be, we wanted. But the number of people that hit the other slot and wrote driving to work, driving to school, taking the bus, i.e. all forms of commuting, right? And so it required us to go back and clean up that report because obviously that data needs to match up. So that's the reason for that distinction to say, look, we examined what we call 502 valid responses where we thought there were no issues with the data.
Right.
And then use those to form our trends.
Now, coming back to the report, my God, you've literally covered everything in this report. I mean, have you missed out on anything?
Oh, definitely. I think there are easily a couple of things that we felt that I definitely had on the initial list of things we would like to address, but we didn't. Part of the reason was just that we don't have data to talk about it. And part of it was, I think, because it was the first report. And we had so much other stuff to talk about in terms of regional trends that were sort of different from what we see globally, that we wanted to focus the report on that. So a simple example is doing an analysis of the type of podcasts.
Right.
So which includes, Q&A type, narrative type, advice, monologues, roundtable type shows or that kind of stuff. Something we didn't touch on. I would have liked to, but I think there's a couple of things, as I mentioned, the reasons already. And I think also we do have a little skew here regionally, where most people that start podcasts, and because there's been a huge number of people that have started podcasts, tend to go down the Q&A format. And so that means that, we can't really talk about, let's say, the impact of a narrative podcast in a region where there aren't that many.
Have people started monetizing podcasts in the Middle East? I know India has to some extent, but what about the Middle East?
Yeah, it's very, very limited. I think we don't yet see, and this is also something we have in our conversations, we are not yet seeing companies jump on board in terms of sponsorships. As we would expect. And I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. Podcasting is fairly new, so I think a lot of people are still kind of trying to understand it.
Right.
Not enough creators. Not enough creators, or the argument would be rather there are a lot of creators, but then a lot of them have just jumped on recently. So we don't have that history where someone can be like, wow, okay, he's been putting out content for 5 years fairly regularly, which is I can rely on that, right? And conversely, and that's true for listenership also, right? Like we do not yet have the numbers here that even in India, just by virtue of the size of the market, will have. Right. So I mean, you take a look at a simple example like Instagram. The average, I think, person that kind of creates an Instagram account around a certain thing that he or she does is in the thousands very quickly in India, whereas here, like getting to 1,000 is like a monumental achievement. And so I think, for the average to be closer to, let's say, 10,000, which I think in India it would be, but here it's probably under 1,000, right? The average Instagram user here.
No, I understand what you're saying.
In terms of followership.
Yeah.
So I think that's one, so at least in India, I think the argument could be made that, okay, even if I were just starting out and I'm only 6 months in, I'd be in the thousands or tens of thousands. I can get there because it's just my circle is that wide. Whereas here the first 1,000 is like very, very hard to break from everything that we've seen and everything that I'm talking to a lot of podcasters. And that's what I keep hearing over and over again, right? Getting to 500, getting to 1,000 listens is very difficult.
When we were doing Tech Tree, we were able to hit that 200-300 mark quite easily, I think, after a couple of episodes.
Yeah, and I think there are other factors there, but if you remember, I mean, it took us a while to go from that 300 to 600.
Yes,
right?
It did. Oh, yes.
Yeah, it did, and I think again it's the same thing. Right? People don't know enough about the. Look at it this way: if 10% of the people know what a podcast is, right? What does that 10% translate to in raw numbers in India versus here?
Oh, okay.
Like, there's no comparison, right? You see what I mean? So the percentage of people can be the same, but the impact of that, the raw number of that, is much higher. So I can if I were to go and say my network carries 10% of all listenership in the UAE, that would actually should be an impressive number. But when you bring it down to raw numbers, the person's like, well, do I want to pay to sponsor something that has only 1,000 or 5,000? And so that's kind of where I think the conversation is today. I expect it to change, of course, but that's where we are today. So to answer the original question also is a lot of the monetization, and that's also the case for us, has been branded podcasting, i.e. companies that want to involve podcasts as part of their strategy, which is what we find a lot of. So we are creating revenue, or we are generating revenue by helping companies start podcasts, right? And working with them through that creative process. So there is a way to do it.
But it also gives them an avenue to express themselves in a different medium, in a different way, and it does help in a big way. So that's actually it's a nice initiative, and I see you've been getting a lot of traction in that space, so that's great. But let's bring it back to creating content, and you see a lot of these content creators. You have Basil in the Middle East, you have a whole bunch of podcasters even in India. So if you have to break it up into two questions, one is, what does it take for a person to actually go out there and create become a content creator for a podcast, and what stops them?
I mean, look, the short answer to the first part of this is actually very little, right? A decent mic can be purchased in under $100 today. In fact, much lesser, but I'm saying $100 for a half decent dynamic microphone that you can plug in front of you, right? Like as you're doing now.
I remember you hooked me up with this ATR 2100, and it's
yeah,
a
and I mean
beautiful
that
piece of.
yeah, and it's
It was $70.
yeah, it oscillates somewhere between $60 and $75 depending on when you purchase. The one reason I love that microphone is because it is both XLR and USB enabled, which means it's very versatile. So
Yes.
tomorrow when you decide to upgrade and you actually invest in a mixer or a recorder or something, this mic is still usable. You don't have to now change your mic because you started out with a USB microphone that connects to your computer, right? So that's one of the reasons why. So yeah, I mean, in under $100, you can pick up a very decent microphone, and start recording with a laptop or even an iPad or an iPhone or something. So actually, like the barrier to entry is very low, right?
Yeah.
In
You
terms
have a lot of
recording.
platforms out there. You have a lot of platforms out there that are supporting podcasters as well, which not a lot of people know about. Like, for example, you use Podient, right? If I'm
Yes.
not mistaken.
Yeah. So
I use Anchor.fm.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of sort of caveats with Anchor in terms of their model. So I would tell people to be cautious. I have nothing against them, hosting with them, but I would just
Yeah.
make people aware of the fact that there's an ownership question similar to as if you were posting on Instagram with Anchor compared to a different platform. But other than that, yeah, I mean, but the barrier to entry, of course, is zero, right? So it is free at the end of the day, which is very helpful. I expect that it's
Yes.
going to stay free for a while. I didn't until this year, but now that they're bought out by Spotify, I'm not expecting them to start charging anytime soon. So there is that advantage with Anchor. But my personal recommendation will always be, foot the $10 or $12 it costs you and find a host where you have complete control.
Absolutely.
But,
And
yeah.
migrate to something that you can afford a few months in if you feel that you're
Exactly.
able to create
Yeah, yeah.
sustainable content.
It's a good
But to
Anchor.
start off with.
Anchor is great for Anchor's great
brilliant.
for starting it out, testing out things, and do that. The one piece of advice I leave people with when they're talking about Anchor also is to not have Anchor submit to the directories. You submit to the directories yourself.
Yes,
Simply
I have
because
done that.
yeah, so simply because that process then to shift later is actually quite painful, and you're at the mercy of Anchor support. Somebody actually and I'm not saying that they're unresponsive. I'm just saying you're just adding this sort of extra layer of complication for yourself down the road. So I'd recommend not doing that. But yeah,
Right.
as a way of starting out and just putting your file somewhere so you can test and see how you feel about podcasts. I mean, again, the point is the barrier to entry is very low. It doesn't take a lot. But that said, I would always tell people to have some kind of a plan when they're
Right.
starting podcasts. I think it's very easy for us to jump in and just say, okay, well, it's not going to cost me that much. I can foot $100 plus minus and start. And we'll see how it goes. That's good. I mean, and of course, you should do that, right? You should also explore and see how it goes. But I think, we've seen now with the industry kind of maturing that most podcasts don't make it beyond episode 10. You and I, we've seen issues with getting our show running consistently.
Yeah.
I mean, we see other issues just from our side with working with a lot of different creators, a lot of different people, as well as observing
We'll
just the
explore
industry.
issues.
Yeah.
We'll explore issues, especially the ones that we faced during Tech Tree in the segment after. But
Yeah, sure.
we'll
but
get to
the
that.
point,
That's
yeah, but the point again is that I think you should have a plan. You should have some
Yes.
sort of an idea of what you're trying to do.
So I think a lot of people jump onto getting podcasts made and they trail off immediately after episode 1 or 2 because they haven't planned content beyond episode 1 or 2, or even the trailer for that matter. I've seen a lot of people who I know personally have started podcasts and have trailed off literally after the trailer. They've put the 2-minute bit to get submissions ready, but they haven't done beyond that.
I mean, take a look at
And
this as a statistic, right? So in December, the Apple Podcast Directory crossed about 800,000 podcasts. 41% of them, sorry, were active in the last like 90 days or so.
No way.
I mean, that's quite a telling stat. Now I'll add a caveat here. The way you define active is tricky, right? So I would say that it's not as clean as it sounds, but it's still quite a telling statistic in the sense that the way they had done it, if I'm right, I can tell you in a second. Yeah, so the way they had measured activeness is has an episode been published in 90 days? right?
That is active.
And
that is activity.
that's active, but well, yes and no, right? So, for example, we do a lot of shows that are seasonal, and there are seasonal breaks that happen, and those seasonal breaks last beyond 90 days sometimes. It doesn't mean we're not working on the show. Yeah, but I think that number is still a very, very small percentage of those that are.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, people who work on seasonal shows, they understand that there's the value of being even certain amount of activity. And I think even you've done this, is that you've put fillers every now and then just to make sure.
Yeah, we do.
Just to make sure that there is some amount of activity on the network, so you people know that you're alive and you're working and you're building something. Everybody does that.
No, sure, and everybody does that. We've had some success with sort of resharing old episodes and those kind of things. So we do that. But I mean, as a statistic, it's very telling that just under 42% are actually active. It's equally telling that 50% of shows have episodes that have more than 10 episodes in them, which means half the shows in Apple Podcast Directory are not beyond episode.
Unfortunately,
10.
TechTree is in that list.
Is one of, well, 10 counts, it's 10 or more, so we count in the other 50%. But anyway, it's the same difference, right? So the point is, again, like half the shows aren't beyond older than episode 10. Now that, of course, some shows have launched recently, so actually it's just natural that they haven't reached there. But again, another telling stat in terms of
right. But I wouldn't count that as such a bad thing, because I mean, some shows actually run the course of the material within 10 episodes, and I would say that is either a well-planned series or just, that's all that they needed to put out there, and they did that. So that could well be their own plan. But having said that, I mean, if you're getting into the podcast as a creator, you would ideally like to have something on a more continuous basis.
So, I mean, then this is sort of the step 2, or the other thing that I encourage people to think about a lot is, what is the purpose you're creating this podcast for? And I think it's important. So, I mean, you might be looking to build your own brand as an interviewer or as a thought leader or whatever. It might be a personal thing for you. It might be an extension of a company you're operating in or own or whatever it might be. Or you're a company yourself and you're kind of doing this as a way, as you mentioned, to express yourself or create a conversation beyond just, sort of the official channels. So I think understanding that purpose is really important. But fundamentally, we're all creating content and we're all creating podcasts for an audience. So, if you're going to put in all the energy and the effort to build a podcast and tell this story and drive traffic and people to it, stopping after 5 episodes, despite however well you've told it, means you're just it's a lot of energy and effort put into something that you're not going to leverage. And I don't necessarily mean when I say leverage that, now that I have 1,000 followers, which means I need to sell something to them. That's not what I mean at all. But it is also the fact that you've told 1,000 or you've got 1,000 people subscribe to your feed, and then you're going to kind of leave them in the lurch after. And I think that there is something to be said about that. Where I generally, if someone comes to me and says, I have this idea that, it's 3 episodes worth, right? And I want to do it, but I want to do it as an audio story. I would make them question whether or not they need to create their own podcast or find another podcast that's willing to do this 3 run with them. Mm-hmm. A 3 episode run with them. And I think that's kind of one of those things that you kind of need to look at, because if you're just going to build all of this stuff for a short run, you might be doing yourself a little disservice. All right.
Now let's address a couple of things that are very important for people who have kind of gotten past what content do I build and how often am I going to do this. So we already kind of touched upon that in terms of the hardware that they need to kind of build up. Like a good microphone is obviously important, but for those who don't, you can use your hands-free. The quality of the sound may not be that great, but it's still acceptable. But when we go beyond that, what are the different obstacles that we face? And we could probably use TechTree as one of the biggest case studies, if I may, of things that could go wrong. And how do you prepare for them? It happened today as well, by the way, between you and me.
Yeah, I guess the tech issues, right? Yeah, I think, look, again, it kind of goes back to the same things we're already talking about, right? When we talk about putting a plan in place and stuff, I think these are some of the things that the reason things falter is because they don't have kind of this idea. I mean, if you remember when we started TechTree, and again, because we're using that as an example, I think we had maybe a couple, if not just one,
Yes.
nearly 2-hour call between the three of us, where we went over all sorts of different things, including topic ideas, but even things about, we talked about, because I remember I put that as a time commitment being something that we wanted to address, for our frequency and what it is that we were ready to commit to, and all of this kind of stuff. And I think that it's important to kind of think through that, especially if you're working with a co-host. And, most people, I think, especially the independent podcasters, start podcasts as a secondary thing. And I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I just mean that, everybody has jobs and they're doing things full time. And this podcast is something that they're doing out of a passion, or it's a passion project for them, which means that time commitment is always going to be tricky, right? Something always comes in the way. Monetizing takes time as well. So it's a bit hard to, it's like, like blogging or even Instagram, right? Or if you can make all sorts of plans about what you'll post about and what you'll write about, and you will keep it up because the passion will drive you for the first, I don't know, 10 posts, right? 8 posts or whatever it is. And then what happens, right? Where then, family gets in the way, work gets in the way, other issues get in the way. And you're then making decisions between something that's important to you and a hobby or a passion that doesn't necessarily pay. I mean, work gets in the way, right? So many times, like, I'm sorry, I'm at work, I can't record today, because work pays the bills and this doesn't, right? Like, as much as we want to romanticize it, that's what these decisions come down to sometimes.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
So I think it's unfortunate, of course, but I think it's important for people to kind of understand the realities of that. I mean, there's a reason why people bank episodes. So they don't launch when they finish their first interview, right? They do a couple and launch. They try to stay ahead of the game a little bit. So, and I think this is something that works for most people or most podcasters, to say, they're at least 2 or 3 interviews ahead of what they're releasing.
Yeah.
Simply because it offers them that flexibility, right?
It's one of the reasons. It's one of the reasons why I'm on a 2-week schedule and not a one every week kind of schedule.
It's exactly what I was going to say. So a release schedule is another great way of kind of managing everybody's expectations. I know I've started shows that were initially 2 a month, and we've moved to monthly because somebody on the show's team it just wasn't working out. And so we said, hey, look, we want to keep the show running. We'll move to monthly. It's fine, right? Like, there's nothing wrong in going back. I don't think, as long as it's communicated well.
Yeah.
But I would say, start under and then work your way up rather than the other way around. So if you feel like, I don't know, I feel like I can do it, but I'm not sure, maybe start as a monthly. And then take it up to 2 a week when you've built up enough content, a content bank, right? So there are a lot of little things I think people can do.
Absolutely.
But there's always going to be other things. So again, coming back to Tech Tree, I mean, we had what I can only call an emergency that caused us to stop recording, right?
Yeah, I moved back to India.
So, yeah, and you moved to India. So I think, and that's I mean, to be honest, I mean, it doesn't matter how astute we were. I don't know if we could have planned for that.
We could not,
right?
have.
So so again, these things do happen. Now, it's another matter that in the case of Tech Tree, you doing that coincided with a number of other things that all put together created a series of events that prevented the show from coming back. But I think I would like to imagine that for a lot of people, maybe it would be one event that would happen. And when that happens, you kind of work your way back. And we did, right? There were a couple of opportunities, I think, where we were, like a few feet away from the record button.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that's something that, you can't account for every emergency, but I think there are things you can do to make sure things go well. Doing seasons is another great way, by the way. I mean, we use that a lot. So obviously we're operating with so many shows.
Yeah. That
it's important for us to kind of make sure that not only are we managing our release and managing expectations and everything else, but we also have to manage, the creators or the host schedule. Right. So a lot of the creators we work with, I mean, they are working full time and are doing these as passion projects, let's say. But even in the branded show stream, where we have there are other things, right? So a company that's working with us to create a show around what they're doing. Yeah, podcast isn't what they're doing, though, right? They're doing something else. And a podcast is one aspect of a larger communication strategy, which means even communication-wise, they have to devote time elsewhere. And so it's so important to kind of really understand what the time commitments are, because in the case of a branded show, as an example, like not only scheduling an interview and preparing and all of that stuff has to be allocated, but then editing time has to be allocated.
Yep.
Edits have to happen, approvals have to happen,
Reviews have to happen.
Reviews have to happen. I mean, yeah. So and that goes through multiple cycles, and at least in an independent show, like again going back to say Tech Tree. Our review meant I would hand it to both of you guys, and you guys would have a listen, come back to me with some notes, and invariably you would tell me, okay, well, just put these in. I think everything else is okay, and we'd release. Right, we could skip a step or two every now and then. In the case of a company show and say, you can't do that, right? Like, so even after that change, you got to go through another review, and then someone else has to hear it. Like, there are a lot of internal processes that have to go through. So really, really understanding, and sometimes you don't really get a full sense of it until you start doing it.
It's true.
Right? And then I think that that's something which would probably be the next piece of advice, maybe, is that keep yourself open to adjusting, especially when in the first few months when you begin.
Right.
I think it's very easy for us to kind of be like, no, but I decided this. Yeah, I know you did, but situation is playing out differently. What you thought would be the amount of time you needed to run an edit might be much longer. You might take longer to edit, you as a person, right? Because you are very careful about every that's in there.
Absolutely.
There's so many other things.
It's very
but
crucial.
I can assure people that
to plan your own time, to know that it's not just the recording, but it's the edit, the review, the edit, the review, and you need to factor in. And I think that scares off a lot of people as well.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, I do tell people, by the way, like, once you figured it out, like, I mean, you can always hire a sound engineer. You can always hire somebody to handle some aspects of it for you. Not everybody needs to know how to edit, right? As in, like, you on the technical side, I mean, you may know how to edit what you want the interview, like what parts of the interview you want to go out.
Yeah.
But an edit, I mean, and I'm sure you have discovered this by now, but we estimated this a little while ago. To put out about a 30-minute or like half an hour of content can take anywhere between 5 and like 40 hours to put together.
Absolutely.
Right? Like it varies depending on kind of show, how many people involved.
And the kind of recording. So if you use good quality equipment, that will drop significantly because you're able to cut through the post-processing of any of sound information dramatically. So if you use good quality equipment, it helps.
No, of course it helps. But I mean, it again, depending. So when we look at more narrative storytelling based shows, I mean, there is a lot of involvement. You have to do so many interviews. I mean, the point again being that just like we have to be really realistic about understanding what it takes to put a piece of content out there and plan around it. I don't think there's anything wrong that it takes you 5 hours to edit something. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But you just need to understand that it takes you 5 hours to edit something and plan with that in mind, rather than being frustrated about the fact that it's taking you 5 hours to edit. And I mean, we've. In some of our edit runs during Tech Tree as well, we had situations where one of us would felt like something was a digression, but the other one was like, yeah, but it was an important point. And those cycles also, you have to allow for that, right? Because that's part of the creative process. And kind of having those discussions, especially when you're working with co-hosts or you're working with, it could be anybody. So I think these are all kind of things people should factor in. I think, and these are, as you mentioned, these are things that scare people, either beforehand, so they don't get started, or after they start, they're like, oh my God, this is a lot of work. Yeah, but you know what? And that's something that like real talk, like content creation is a lot of work. And this is true even if you run an Instagram account, and as everybody else does, that, as you start to build a picture feed, you get more and more considerate about what you're posting.
Yeah. Right?
You start making all of these extra decisions about, will this look good in my feed or not? Is this something people want to listen? As your followers start to increase, you're like, should I post? You have all of these things. Content creation doesn't matter. Instagram for me is a very simple way of putting out content, because you took a picture, you post it, even if you didn't write the most beautiful caption, right? There is a even lower barrier to entry, and even there it's taking us time, right? Most people today have stopped posting in their feeds because they like the fact that you can post something, the story goes away in 24 hours, and then it doesn't have to match the rest of your feed. Like it has played a part in why people are sharing this way. So there's a lot of content creation is work, and I think that's something people should always understand. It doesn't matter what format.
All right. So now I think we've covered quite a bit of information for a person who's trying to jump into podcasting. Is there something that you want to kind of sum it up? Is there a way that you like to kind of round it off and say, Just round it off.
Are you saying that two podcasters sitting across from each other are having trouble with an outro? That's what it sounds like right now.
I haven't had this so much fun. All right, I'm going to try it again.
and I no, actually, I think we should put this out there to people so they understand. Just imagine two podcasters who've been doing this for some level of some time. Sometimes you have trouble with an outro, and it's something as simple as a thing you're doing every week. So be prepared that it will take time, and you'll have all kinds of blocks, including, like I said, can't write an outro. So what do we do? How do we tie this together? How do we bring this together? Yeah.
Actually, that's a very interesting point. So I'm going to bring it back. So I'm going to probably keep that as a part of the outro as well.
Sure.
But a very important portion of actually planning the content is, do you go scripted or do you go extempo? Because a lot of this, what we're doing right now, is extempo. I have some of the reference material in front of me, but then all of the stuff is just coming no filter.
No, there's no one way or the other here.
There's no
I would say there's no one way or the other. Both are correct and both are wrong, and a lot of it depends on the kind of show you're doing is the primary factor, in my opinion, as to what that would do. But a lot of it also depends on other little things. There are some people who are very good at in interviews, so they can have a whole conversation. They don't tend to lose track very much. And so, as you mentioned, now you have some reference material in front of you. You kind of have thought about what the points are you wanted to talk to me about, and that's fine because you know that even if we digress, it's fine. The conversation will be okay, and you'll remember that to ask these three very, very important questions. The rest of it, you're happy to let it kind of flow. But I know there are other people who, they're just because that's how they are. When they're sitting in a room and they're doing that, they tend to be like, man, I don't remember the next question. And so for them, it's important to have that, one. Or two, who are not necessarily like you mentioned, you're happy to just kind of prompt me and say, fine, hey, what about this thing? But some people don't like how that sounds in the edit. So you may go back and be like, man, that question sounded like I was daft or something. And if that's how you feel as a person, maybe you should script your questions. Right? So you should actually write out your questions so you can read them out or close to read them out. So you have the right words you want to communicate, especially if you're not going to do a voiceover or an intro later. So I think there are a lot of, these are the factors that make those decisions.
Right.
So are you going to do post-processing? Are you going to record for example, are you going to record an intro later? You are not, because you introed me, right? But some people are like, look, you know what? I don't want to do this intro right now because I don't want to break the flow of the conversation. I just start with a hi and start a conversation, and I'll add an intro later. Now, obviously, that will be scripted. And then again, type of show. So Q&A shows are very different from narrative ones, and narrative ones tend to be very scripted. At least the voiceover work and the storytelling has to be scripted. Like we rarely do that extempo. So like I said, I think a lot of it depends on the kind of show you're doing, the kind of person you are, the kind of interviewer you are. All of this makes a difference. But at the end of the day, of course, the answers you get, the less scripted they are, the better. The more natural they are, the better.
The more real they are, the better.
Yeah, the more real they are, the better. I think audio is an extremely powerful medium in what it can do. There's so much study around us as humans and our natural inclinations and all of that. And I use those when I talk to people about podcasts quite a lot because I think audio can be very powerful. For me, the equivalent is like a book, right? You put the words, but you leave it to the consumer's imagination.
Right.
The rest of it, right? You don't get to give them a visual cue that says, when I'm saying I walked down a street, this is what the street looked like. No, you can at best describe the street in a few plot points, and then the rest of it is in the listener's head. That's powerful. That's very powerful.
It's huge,
right? And it's huge. So I think the more real we get with that kind of stuff, the better. But that doesn't mean, by the way, that we don't edit, right? So. We were having this discussion recently. We were doing a panel around podcasting in November, and one of the audience asked us this question where they were like, "Hey, I've done this show and I'm kind of putting the stuff out there, and it's a Q&A based show, so I'm editing very little. But I had this particular person, and he digressed so much. There is so much unnecessary information in my audio. What do I do? Do I edit? Do I leave it raw? Like, what do I decide to do, right?" And I think. Naturally, it was a very subjective question, but and we had sort of a difference of opinion on the panel as well, right? So one person was like, no, I would, if the show you're putting, I like things to be, I like things to be as natural and raw as possible. And so the more natural and raw, the better, which means if there's a digression, big deal. And I don't feel that way.
It also builds up to the point as how relevant that digression is.
Yeah, but yes and no. I mean, I know people that will say, look, I'm not going to edit. If my guest comes on and has a digression, we had the digression. It was part of the conversation. If you're coming in to listen to me, you're it's kind of like, think of this metaphor of like sitting at the table next to two people chatting and listening in on that conversation. Those conversations will have digressions and will go all sorts of places, and whatever, you should be okay with it. I'm going to publish it as it is. I'm not of that view, but I know a lot of people who are, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I have not put a piece of content out there that hasn't been edited. And I don't intend to change that sort of mode of operation. Because I don't think it necessarily takes away from the rawness. I think we can maintain that in the edit. But I do, I'm of the view that like at the end of the day, someone's hitting a play on an episode because they read a description, or they either because they follow us or because they read a description that meant something to them and they wanted to check us out. And if you are doing that for something I'm creating, I want to be respectful of your time. And so when something is that far away from what you're doing, it's like this. We had this 15-minute digression that caused us to have an episode an hour long. Well, if I removed that 15 minutes, like I would have an episode that was 45 minutes long. That saved you, the listener, 15 minutes. Right. And so it's a question of, would I do that? And for me, the answer has always been yes, of course I would do that. Of course, there has to be a point. But then there are other shows which take a lot more heavy editing when we are actually making a point ourselves, right? So Tales is a good example of that, where each episode has a central theme in what it is like to be an entrepreneur.
But you guys plan that episode to the T. I mean, you know exactly what you're going in with. Obviously, answers could range from anywhere between however detailed the guy wants to answer. But then you go and plan. So, there's very little scope for digression out there.
No, not actually. That's not true at all. Look, I mean, if you look at Tales, the average episode is 30 minutes long. The average interview is an hour and a half long.
No way.
Yeah. So we have a lot of digression and in a way, in the raw interview, that's a great thing, because the more the entrepreneur shares with us, the better. In many ways, a lot of times, a lot of conversations that happen behind the scenes with the entrepreneur are around conversations around entrepreneurship, what it really means to them, trends in entrepreneurship, what they have seen, the kind of challenges they have felt, which may or may not make the cut, but it helps inform the larger conversation around entrepreneurship for us, and then what we can try and kind of distill a little bit here and there to our listeners. So, but of course there are a lot of digressions. We hear so many stories, right, that of things that may have happened that eventually maybe just become a single sentence in the final episode, where we just kind of jump over the storyline in a certain way because the other things are important, or other themes are important. But honestly, we don't necessarily know the theme directly before the interview.
Right.
The goal of the interview is really to get to the bottom of who they are and how their business was created. Absolutely. And then the overarching theme tends to happen in the edit generally.
Got it.
The other show, which is the other narrative show, that's very different, and that is more along the lines of what you're saying, which is we kind of have a very, very almost clear central theme with Karma Sutra when we start to say, hey, this week we're going to talk about, let's say, the second episode we did was about how there are certain people that are living in communities that are not of their own, right? So we had, for example, this Brazilian couple that was living in a very Indian-dominated neighborhood in Dubai. And more people like them. So it was a very, very clear thing. So then when we went into the interview, we were talking to them about that only and that only. I mean, it's not like we didn't have other conversations with them, but those interviews were fairly short and fairly to the point. But with Tales, I mean, honestly, like I said, the average interview is between 90 minutes to 2 hours long.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah. Right. So let's wrap this up. Let's kind of put the top 5 points that you think a podcaster needs to have in mind when, they're building their podcast or when they're trying to put content out there, like a summary.
So my first is always going to be have a plan. I think it's super important. You need to know what you're trying to do. The second, which ties into the first, is have some kind of a mission or a mission statement of sorts. What is it that you're hoping to achieve with this podcast? Because I think it factors in, especially later on, when you are getting past that episode 8 and 10 and 15. It starts to when you're out of those initial ideas that you have, how you get your next set of ideas will depend a lot on this thing. Who is the next person you will want to interview, and does he or she fit into that mission? I think that's super important. And 3, I think, is be realistic with your time. So it looks easy, but content creation isn't. I would encourage anybody to start out, right? Like, get into it, look at it.
But it's very rewarding.
But also then examine, and then examine what it is that's costing you, what is it that is making you do, how long it's taking you to do it. Can you farm something out? When you're working with a co-host, I mean, it's it's almost like having a co-founder, right? Establish some set of priorities and roles in the situation. Who's going to edit it, who's going to do what. All of these things, I have at least a conversation, even if it lasts 10 minutes. Yeah, but have it, because it helps later on. But I mean, more importantly, it also keeps things realistic for you, because, as I said, content creation is a decent bit of work, and being realistic about it is so important about that. For me, 4 and 5, these are the top 3 things I tell everybody now when they start doing it. But I would add just a couple extra notes, which is when you're explore things as well, and don't forget to talk to listeners or talk to people as much as you can. It's very easy to live in a podcast bubble. Because as much as we use the example of it's like 2 people having a conversation and someone sitting at the next table and gets to hear it. Yeah, it is very intimate and very nice, but actually you don't record like that, right? Invariably you record in a quiet room with yourselves. And I think it's important sometimes to step out and have people actually ask people what they think of your show. Especially when you're starting out, I think a lot of times, we do live in a culture where people tend to respond only when they want to outrage or they want to complain, which is fine. That's just how it is. But it also means you need to put an extra effort if you want feedback, because people will not generally respond to you easily at first. And it's important to go out and get that feedback, because that will help you shape what you're doing. There was a conversation recently on Twitter where someone said, hey, I'm getting my interview. I try to keep my interviews raw, and I try to publish everything. And I'm getting a lot of feedback from listeners to say, I like your show, but you're too long. And what should I do? And a couple of people chimed in and were like, well, you're doing this for yourself. At the end of the day, it's your content. If you want to keep it raw, go out there. And I was like, yeah, that's all that is great. But you're doing this for your listeners. And if your listeners are complaining, and enough of them are complaining, maybe you should revisit what it is that you're doing. Because at the end of the day, you want them to listen, right? And if they're telling you that the length of the episode is a barrier to listen, you need to address that barrier in some way, whether it means splitting the episode into 2 parts or tightening your interviews, whatever it might be. So I think it's important to go out there and talk and not entirely live in the bubble.
Cool. So what podcasts are you listening to right now?
I'm assuming you mean outside of my own, right?
Obviously.
Quite a few. I mean, so I do listen to a couple of tech ones fairly regularly. I find I can listen to these tech roundtable type shows while I'm doing other things, like while I'm working as well. So it allows me to consume and stay on top of things quite often.
Name names?
The Accidental TED podcast is one of my favorites. Okay. It's funny because it's very similar, right? Like it's 3 people, like 3 tech guys discussing tech things. I mean, they kind of focus themselves around Apple, but then they do talk general tech things when the news is big enough. So I do really enjoy that. Reply All was a show I really enjoyed. Of late I find I don't know, I'm not relating to their episodes so much. I think some of their more recent episodes tend to be very American centric, and so it's kind of losing. I'm not saying that they may not come back from it, but I haven't had a good episode recently. But for anybody that's interested in almost new age reporting, I will always recommend them to listen to episodes 102 and 103 of the show, Reply All. I'll just give a quick brief, but basically one of the hosts gets called by a scam gets a scam phone call basically saying that his computer is infected and he needs to, give the tech support guy calling access to his computer so he can remove it and then recommend an antivirus for him.
Right.
And he kind of, because he used to be an IT support guy in his life, he was like, of course, this is a scam. And so he tries to get to the bottom of the scam. And I think it's just one of those really interesting, I mean, the storytelling is brilliant, I think. But also it just shows sometimes, when you're just so that obsessed with something, how far you can go and how far you'll take it. I mean, he called them for months. Like he would just keep calling the number until he would get hold of the same guy again and then try to figure out their hierarchy. And it turns out the call center was based in India. So I think there was that tie-in for me also. I just thought it was just really interesting. So it was a call center based out of Delhi, I believe. But it's a two-parter that I think it's just very well done in terms of, like good podcast content. So I think that's a show I've always enjoyed and I keep listening to fairly recent. I mean, that I would also recommend to other people. But other than that, I mean, I'm always trying out new shows and always trying out.
Have you heard our first episode?
I started listening to it. I'm think about 20 minutes in, and then something came up, and I had to go deal with it. So it's still It's still in my playlist right now.
Awesome.
But again, I will confess that my playlist tends to be quite long.
Yes. So what did you think of the first 20 minutes then?
Good. I mean, it's a good start. I mean, I think I've always known with respect to you that like your mission has always, I mean, even during Tech Tree, right? That was the same or a very similar mission that you had in terms of having conversations with people around tech and trying to simplify it for everybody. I mean, that's the work you were doing as well. So I think it kind of fits in. I mean, I'm curious to see how the show keeps playing out and obviously to eventually hear this episode.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
No, it's my pleasure.
You're always welcome to come on as a guest. If you find this something that you'd like to share with us, feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to have you on board.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's always, anywhere between you and me, there's always tech stuff we can always talk about.
Absolutely.
But I think there is always a case to be made for sort of a secondary podcast conversation that can maybe more suited for people who've been doing it for a little while and want to do more. Because I think a lot of conversations, again, tend to be around how do you get started? How do you prepare content? But then there are a lot of people who are been doing it for a little while and then kind of are like, okay, well, how do I keep going? What do I do here? How do I expand these content pieces? And I think that there's, it would be nice to also talk to them.
Nice. Anyway, thank you very much, Chirag. How can a person reach out to you if they want to kind of connect with you outside of this podcast?
I mean, obviously we're on social. I mean, I use Twitter and Instagram more often than the others. So it's Chirag and I on both for me personally, and then AMAEYA.media or AMAEYA Media on Twitter and AMAEYA.media on Instagram to connect with us and what, if you want to catch what we're doing.
Right. As always, you can reach out to the East Podcast on our website. That's eastpodcast.in. We're on all the social media. That's Twitter, Instagram as the East Podcast. Feel free to reach out to us. You can email me on host@eastpodcast.in. Thank you very much for joining us for this episode. I had a lot of fun recording this episode with Chirag. We're going to keep all the funny bits in there. So if you've reached this far, don't forget to share this podcast with your friends. And do stay tuned for more. There's going to be a lot of fun content coming up in the weeks to come again.